silent mode. Please may I also draw your attention to the fact that the Chair of the Inquiry, the Right Honourable Sir Justice Haddon-Cave, has made a restriction order in relation to the conduct of those who are attending this and future hearings. The full order is displayed on the inquiry website and on the door of this court and of the media annex, but I will summarise its purpose. The order, which applies to this and to all future hearings of the inquiry, prohibits any person from making an audio or video recording of inquiry proceedings from within the hearing rooms without the express permission of the Chair. Furthermore, no person may take a photograph in any room in which inquiry proceedings are taking place and at a time the inquiry is sitting without the express permission of the Chair. For the avoidance of doubt, both of these prohibitions extend to the hearing in the media annex. A further part of the order arises as the live stream of these inquiry proceedings via YouTube will purposely be subject to a 10-minute delay. It is prohibited that any person may disclose, publish or broadcast in any form or by any means anything that is said or done in the inquiry hearing room until 10 minutes after it has taken place. If an application is made for a restriction order in relation to anything that has been said or done in the inquiry hearing room in the preceding 10 minutes, anything that was said or done during that period is subject to a restriction order prohibiting its disclosure, repetition or duplication until the Chair has finally determined the application. All of the above orders are subject to a penal notice. This means that any breach of any element of the restriction orders may be certified to the High Court or the Court of Session, who will have the power to fine or imprison anyone found to have been in breach of the order. Court rise. This is an open hearing in Court 73 at the Royal Courts of Justice as part of the independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan. The hearing is before Lord Justice Haddon-Cave, the Chair of the inquiry.
A warm welcome, everybody, to the inquiry relating to Afghanistan. This is the first day of a series of substantive witness hearings that will be held in the coming weeks and months. Admiral Radakin, thank you for coming to give evidence to the inquiry today in your capacity as the Chief of the Defence Staff. I know that these are particularly busy times, so I will hand over straight away to the inquiry lead counsel, Mr. Glasgow, KC. Mr. Glasgow.
Sir, thank you. Could I please invite Admiral Radakin to step into the witness box?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Admiral, could you please give us your full name?
I'm Admiral Sir Anthony Radakin.
Now, Admiral, I know that you've got a number of documents in front of you, and can I check that we know what you have so that those who are following online understand as well? I hope you have available to you a copy of your witness statement, which runs to some 77 pages.
That's correct.
And you also have available to you a small file which identifies a number of exhibits that you have provided, which I'm going to be inviting you to help us with in due course.
Yes, thank you.
And before we embark on any of the detail in your witness statement, can I just deal with a few introductory matters, please? As you've already been introduced by the Chair to the inquiry, you are a Royal Navy Admiral and you are the Chief of the Defence Staff. So that we understand what that means, please, sir, can you tell us what your role is as Chief of the Defence Staff.
Yes, I'm the principal military advisor to both the Secretary of State for Defence and to the Prime Minister.
And have you been authorised to make the statement on behalf of the Secretary of State for Defence in response to various inquiries made by the inquiry legal team?
Yes, that's correct.
And so that we're clear how this morning and this afternoon and then into tomorrow will work. Insofar as your witness statement is concerned, can I have your confirmation, please, that it's true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
And what I'm going to do in due course at the end of your evidence will be to ask that your witness statement is put up on the inquiry website so that everyone will know what your evidence has been based upon. But can I formally introduce your witness statement into evidence, because I don't propose to ask you about every single line within that document, sir. What I'm going to do is to ask your help on certain aspects within the statement and to invite you to look at some of the exhibits that you have provided. And I'm going to deal with questions that have been invited for us to make from some of the core participants. The timetable for today, so that everyone understands it, will be that we'll sit, I expect now, straight through till lunch at 1 o'clock. We'll resume at 2. There's likely to be a short break about halfway through the afternoon, and then we'll probably end sometime between 4:15 and 4:30. If at any stage you need a break, will you let us know? The courtroom is actually extremely warm today. That wasn't deliberate. But it will get, I'm sure, quite hot and stuffy in here, not least because you're listening to me. So if you need a break at any stage, please let us know.
Certainly.
I can assure everybody I've made a telephone call to deal with that.
Thank you.
Now then, Admiral, before we deal with the summary of your witness statement and then go into the details, can I just deal with something that's important at the outset? Did you serve in Afghanistan?
No, I didn't, and neither was I in command of operations in Afghanistan during that time. I think I'm here as what is called a corporate witness.
And in order to complete your witness statement, have you had access to a large amount of material, some of which you've seen before, but some of which you've seen in order to make the statement?
Yes, that's correct.
Now then, can we just look, please, together, if you wouldn't mind, at your executive summary of the witness statement? And for those who are following the document, I'm going to turn, please, to paragraph 7 onwards. And the reason for taking you to this straight away is what I'd like to do is identify the areas that you have been asked to assist, and so that everyone will be able to follow your evidence when they have the statement. A number of sections have been set out within the body of your statement, which we're going to look at. First of all, will we be embarking on a consideration of background matters such as rank and doctrine to assist us with an understanding of the armed forces in general?
Yes.
And then, dealing with a number of separate matters, first, will you be able to help us with an overview of the UK Armed Forces and the structure of the separate 3 services?
That's correct.
Will we be able to consider as well the operational responsibilities of those 3 services?
Yes.
And then will we be able to consider, with your help, a description of the organisational structure of the armed forces in Afghanistan?
Yes.
And of course, for the purposes of this inquiry, we're going to focus on the period of mid-2010 to mid-2013. And insofar as it's relevant, will we be able to ask for your help on the campaign itself, including the oversight, management and evolution of the campaign?
Yes.
And in particular, will you be able to help us with the counterinsurgency doctrine?
Yes.
And then so that we have a better understanding of what faced the UK Armed Forces whilst they were in Afghanistan, can we have your help, please, in due course on the insurgency and the threats faced by UK troops?
Absolutely.
And then dealing with some of the particular details, will you be able to help us with troop numbers and rotations, and importantly, the number of UK personnel who were either wounded or who lost their lives whilst on deployment?
Yes.
And we will touch, I anticipate in part at least, on the relationship between the armed forces whilst they were in Afghanistan and the Afghan National Defence and Security Forces.
Yes.
Insofar as the period that we are concerned with, between mid-2010 to mid-2013, were there 8 6-month rotations of UK conventional forces as part of Operation Herrick?
That's correct.
And was Operation Herrick the name that was given to the deployment of conventional forces in Afghanistan?
That's also correct.
I'm not going to take you through the exact composition of what was known as Task Force Helmand. Clearly, it would have varied from rotation to rotation. But insofar as we touch upon it in any detail later on during the statement, have you been able to appraise yourself of the different rotations, and are you able to assist us with any particular questions on those different rotations?
Yes, I can.
Now then again, when I identified some of the summary that you had given, and we were going to touch upon, rank and structures is obviously something that you're able to assist us with, but I'm not going to embark on a discussion with you about rank and structures within the separate divisions of the armed forces. That material will be available on the website in due course. It's set out in your statement, and it's perhaps familiar to a large number of people in the room in any event. Can I turn, please, with your help, to look at section 3 in your witness statement, which deals with the question of military doctrine as a source?
Yes.
Have you provided the inquiry with a number of different documents which set out military doctrine as it applies to the armed forces?
Yes, we have.
And can you help us in a very general sense, first of all, with what we should understand as military doctrine and its significance to the UK armed forces?
Yes, doctrine we see as an essential part of how we fight as an organisation and how we go about our business.
And as far as the doctrine is concerned, is it a formal piece of guidance, or sorry, is it a formal instruction, or is it more guidance for the UK armed forces to follow?
It is guidance rather than formal instruction.
And does it need to be considered alongside the applicable law of armed conflict or anything else that's relevant?
Absolutely.
Insofar as the guidance might change from time to time, is that what happens? Does it develop over time, and does it develop during the course of a campaign?
Doctrine definitely adjusts over time, and in campaigns, doctrine also adjusts so that you can refine that to achieve your aims, and you're learning as you're progressing through those campaigns.
And is the purpose of the process of adaptation intended to enable the armed forces to secure the ultimate aim of the campaign?
It is, and it's to assist those forces that are embarked on that campaign to be as effective as possible.
One of the requests that was made by the inquiry of the Ministry of Defence was to assist us with the organisational structure and responsibilities of the Ministry of Defence, the UK Armed Forces, and also the Joint Forces Command. And I'm looking for your assistance, and for those of others who are following, to paragraph 15 onwards in your statement. And what I'd like to do with your help, please, Admiral, is to consider some of what is set out in your statement and to look at some of the documents that you have provided to us. Can I turn and invite you, please, on your page 6 to paragraph 18? And here you deal with the structure of the Defence Council, the Defence Board, and the separate service boards. As far as the armed forces are concerned, who is ultimately responsible for administering and commanding them?
So that is the Secretary of State for Defence, and that authority comes from the Crown and is vested in the Chair of the Defence Council, the Secretary of State for Defence.
And as far as the role of the Defence Council, can you explain to us, please, Admiral, what its role is so that we can understand the part it has to play?
Its formal role is to command and administer the armed forces, and it does that through the Defence Council and then through to the 3 single service boards, the boards of the Army, Navy and Air Force.
And insofar as the authority that those service boards have, do they have authority over their own individual services?
Yes, they do.
Now, you were able to assist us with a diagram that sets out this particular structure. You'll find that in your black file, Admiral, if you look to it, to the lettered sections at the back, and in particular it's letter A because it is figure A. And could I please ask, for those who want to follow on the screen, that figure A is brought up. And we can see that the figure here, your figure A, identifies the structure that you were just describing to us. And could we just look together at that for a moment so that we understand how it works? You told us that the Defence Council is assisted by the separate service board. So if we look at the diagram, we can see in effect it's split into two sides. So if we start on the right-hand side with your help, Admiral, dealing first with the Defence Council, which is chaired by the Secretary of State, we can see that runs down to the Admiralty Board, the Army Board, and the Air Force Board. And are those the three separate service boards you described to us?
That is correct.
We can see that from them we run down to the separate Navy Board, the Executive Committee of the Army Board, and then the Standing Committee of the Air Force Board. If we look to the left, we see the Defence Ministerial Committee. And can you help us, please, with the structure of that committee and the role that it has to play?
So the Defence Ministerial Committee reflects the wider political leadership of the department, and the Defence Council has the Secretary of State at its head, and the Secretary of State also chairs the Defence Ministerial Committee.
We can see both the Defence Board and the Chief of Staff's Committee that sits beneath the Defence Ministerial Committee, and then the Defence Operating Board and the various sub-boards beneath that. As far as the Defence Board is concerned, is that the most senior committee in the Ministry of Defence?
Yes.
And is it responsible for a full range of defence business other than the conduct of operations?
That's correct.
As to the Chief of Staff's Committee, which we can see sitting in the diagram to the left-hand side alongside the Defence Board, is that the main forum through which you seek military advice from the separate single service chiefs?
Yes, so the Chief of Defence Staff chairs the Chiefs of Staff Committee and uses that committee to formulate the advice as the Chief of Defence Staff on operational matters for the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence.
And if we just consider the position back in 2010, and in case it assists you, I'm looking on your statement, page 8, and it's to the top of that page. As far as in 2010, the Chief of Staff Committee, did that comprise full 6 members at the time?
Yes, so that's the Chief of Defence Staff, the Permanent Secretary, the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, the First Sea Lord, the Chief of the General Staff, and the Chief of the Air Staff.
And just taking us a little further on in time, if we consider just after the period with which we're concerned, but in 2014, did the commander of the Joint Forces Command also become a member of that committee?
Yes, and is a member of that committee now, but under the different title of Strategic Command.
As far as the Ministry of Defence is concerned, can I take you, please, in your statement to paragraph 24, still on your page 8. And the Ministry of Defence you've described there as both a military strategic headquarters and a Department of State.
Yes.
And can you explain to us the difference between those two functions and how they sit alongside each other?
Yes, so the Department of State is a reflection that the Ministry of Defence is the same as any other government department, and therefore it has those responsibilities for the budget, for the overall policy and the enactment of the government's policy in all of its broader capacity. Where we refer to the military strategic headquarters, is to break out that distinction that we have in defence of our responsibility for military operations.
So in effect, we're splitting the two roles, one the business role and one the military role, in two.
Yes.
But the same body provides the same assistance, but just in two separate halves. Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yes.
Now again, in case it helps everyone to follow the breakdown and the structure that you've just described to us, could we look please to your figure B? And again, could I please ask that that's provided on the screen? In fact, we don't have it. That's my fault. That's always a good start. Second document, and we can't get it there. That's my fault, and I apologise. Insofar as figure B is concerned, what you had done is, in a diagram, had you set out the structure and the shared roles between the PUS on one side and yourself as CDS on the other?
Yes.
And what we'll do is we'll get that available, and it can certainly be put up on the website in due course. Can I just ask you then about the 3 single services and to identify the different service chiefs? And in case it helps you to find that within the body of your statement, we turn to paragraph 28. You've told us a separate service chief for the 3 individual services. And does that mean we've got the chief of the naval staff, otherwise known as the First Sea Lord for the Navy?
Yes, that's right.
The chief of the general staff for the Army?
Yes.
And then the chief of the air staff for the Royal Air Force?
Yes.
And insofar as their responsibilities are concerned, do they each have command over and are responsible for the generation and development of the forces in their respective services?
That's correct.
And after April 2013, did the role that each of them performed for their separate services see it be conducted alongside Joint Forces Command?
Yes.
And we'll turn to consider Joint Forces Command a little later on, but very briefly, if you could at this moment, Admiral, could you just explain to us Joint Forces Command so we understand what it is, since we've touched upon it?
Yes, so people will be familiar with a Navy, Army and Air Force, but to make those 3 single services effective, we refer to, in effect, the glue, and that glue consists of communications, an operations hub. It also includes some separate entities, such as special forces, medical services, and also our overseas commands. And those are all essential enablers to work with the 3 single services in order to be effective on operations.
You've set out in some detail the separate structures of the 3 services, and in particular the ranks within them. Since we're going to focus on the Army, can I just invite you to turn straight to that? I mean no disservice to either of the other 2 services. The information will be available in the statement online, but what I'd like to do is to focus on the Army, and if anyone wants me to ask questions about either the Navy or the Air Force, of course I will ask them. But insofar as the structure of the Army is concerned, and we're focusing, of course, on the period 2010 to 2013, the Chief of the Army was, as he was just described by me, the Chief of the General Staff.
Yes.
And, in effect, the budget holder for land forces.
Yes, and the top-level budget holder in our language, and responsible for the morale and the fighting effectiveness of the Army.
And we'll come to consider morale and fighting effectiveness in due course, because some of the exhibits you've provided offer some assistance about those 2 theories and how they fit in to fighting power. Beneath him, and just touching on the titles if we may, rather than the details of them, he is assisted by the Assistant Chief of General Staff, and then, as known at the time, the Commander-in-Chief of Land Forces,
Yes.
now known as Commander Land Forces. And then sitting in the structure beneath that 4-star, we have the Commander Field Army, the Adjutant General, the Commander of Force Development and Training, and then the Commander of Joint Helicopter Command.
Yes.
And again, if anyone needs, there are charts that set out the structure of those. I'm not going to turn to them now, but they'll be available if people want to look at them. Can I just ask you very briefly about the permanent joint headquarters? You'll find that in your witness statement on page 12, and I'm turning to look at section 4 and in particular paragraph 41. Permanent joint headquarters, often referred to as PJHQ, commanded by the Chief of Joint Operations. And what role does PJHQ play, please?
So this is a requirement to fulfill the role of what we call National Operational Level Command. So the Chief of Joint Operations is responsible for the planning and execution of joint or potentially joint national and UK-led multinational operations conducted outside the UK.
And is PJHQ staffed by many hundreds of individuals from the separate single services and the civil service?
That's right. It's a combination of Royal Navy, Army, Air Force and MOD civil servants, and numbers in excess of 500.
Can we please have your help on the responsibilities in the context of the conduct of operations? And I'm going to ask you to look in your statement, please, to section 5, and it's page 13 onwards. Insofar as any decision might be taken to commit the UK Armed Forces to any operation, with whom does that decision rest, please?
That's with the Prime Minister.
And in terms of how the Prime Minister takes that decision, is he or she assisted by a number of individuals and bodies before committing UK Armed Forces to any operation?
Yes, we would anticipate that the Prime Minister of the day would take advice on those military operations from both the Secretary of State for Defence and the Chief of Defence Staff, but that would be done in conjunction with either their Cabinet or the National Security Council.
And just reminding everyone, insofar as the Chief of Defence Staff is concerned, that of course being you at the moment, the CDS is the government's principal military advisor.
Yes, that's correct.
Insofar as the Secretary of State for Defence is concerned, what responsibility does he or she have?
So the Secretary of State for Defence is then responsible for the direction and conduct of all operations and is accountable to Parliament in their resourcing. So that means the providing of strategic direction, endorsing the allocation of resources, and also setting constraints on the use of force.
And insofar as the use of force is concerned, in particular force levels and the rules of engagement, are they subject to policy decisions made by ministers taking into account legal advice?
Yes.
And decisions such as those, are they recorded in what is known as a CDS directive?
That's right. A CDS directive is issued, and that's in the role of the Chief of Defence Staff as the military strategic commander, then responsible for the planning, direction and conduct of military operations, having gained that initial direction and flow of authority from the Secretary of State for Defence.
Now, in terms of the assistance that the Chief of Defence Staff is provided with, please, when we touched on the structure earlier on, you told us about the Vice Chief of Defence Staff as well as the 3 separate service chiefs. And do they provide advice to CDS, and in particular at the moment to you, on any operations that might be required?
Yes, and that's where what we refer to as the Chiefs Committee is the vehicle for those other chiefs to be able to provide the CDS with that advice.
And how do we understand the balance being struck between military strategy on the one hand and government policy on the other? So how is it that we're to understand those two roles coming together so that there is one direction?
To that, the policy aspect, in a way, is mirrored with the permanent secretary. So if the Chief of Defence Staff is the principal military advisor, then the permanent secretary is the principal policy advisor. And it's then those two individuals bringing those two aspects together in order to fulfil the direction that's being provided by both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence.
And insofar as the CDS directive that we mentioned just a moment ago that you helped us with, is that used to appoint an operational commander to provide strategic direction? Does it identify the military conditions for success? Does it designate the theatre and joint operations area? And does it specify force levels and resources and promulgate the constraints on the use of force and then set the strategic intelligence requirements?
Yes.
And that, of course, is done by CDS with assistance from, as you've just told us, the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, the service chiefs, and a consideration of governmental policy.
Yes, that's correct.
In order to try to bring that to light, and so we can consider the chain of command for joint operations, I'm going to chance my arm and see if we've got figure C. We do. It seems my alphabet likes to miss out the second letter. I'm very sorry for that. But if we look to figure C, if we just concentrate, thank you very much indeed. You've got that if it's easier to look at in your file available to you. But as we can see on the screen, a number of coloured boxes identifying separate individuals or bodies. It's termed the operational chain of command. And we can see that descriptions on the left start with strategic and work their way down then to operational and tactical. And could we just have your assistance, please, as we look at this particular plan on how the information flows from one body or individual to the others and what we're to understand by the significance of the arrows on the page?
Yes, certainly. So we described earlier the direction coming initially from the Prime Minister, then the Secretary of State. That then is formulated into a CDS directive, as we've just discussed. The principal recipient of the CDS directive is the Chief of Joint Operations, but it also includes instructions for the single services and joint forces commanders then was, as to their roles in the operation that's being described. That then gives the signal for the Navy, Army and Air Force and Joint Forces Command to provide the deployable forces that you see at the bottom right. And then that allows the Chief of Joint Operations to then conduct his operations. And then coming back up on the left-hand side is a system of, are those operations achieving the aim? What is actually going on? And that being fed up through so that you have assurance that the direction that you have provided is being achieved. And that goes all the way up to ministers for their assurance as well. And it also, at the top right, it goes across to the Chiefs Committee so that the Chiefs Committee can continue to take an awareness of how is the operation going and to assist the Chief of Defence Staff in their role as the principal advisor to both the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence.
And if we just look then to the structure on the left, which has ministers at the top, JFT commander at the bottom, we can see that the arrow on the left-hand side is advice taken from bottom to top, which then leads to the flow of direction from top to bottom down.
Yes.
Can I please ask you about Joint Forces Command? And insofar as the relevance that that may have to the terms of reference for this inquiry, can I identify immediately that Joint Forces Command, or JFC, was formed in April 2012? So about a year or so before the end of the relevant period with which this inquiry is concerned. Can you help us, please, in a little more detail now with Joint Forces Command, its establishment and the role that it has to play?
Yes, so Joint Forces Command was a product from the review that was conducted by Lord Levine, and it was recognition that those aspects that I talked about before, that whether those are communications, medical, special forces, our overseas bases, our operational hub that we described as the permanent joint headquarters, that they needed to be tighter knit into the rest of defence. So they were put together under a single organisation with a 4-star commander, initially called Joint Forces Command and today called Strategic Command. And that was to try to elevate them because of their cruciality in the way that modern operations are run.
Can we just look very briefly at one of the diagrams that you have provided for us in order to better understand the description you've just given? It is figure D, and I hope it is one that we have available. And as we looked at the structure as set out, we can see the Prime Minister and the National Security Council sit at the top. Beneath them, the Defence Secretary and Ministers. Then beneath that, there is the Defence Board, and we can see the structures set out beneath it. Could we just have your help with this structure so that we can better understand what you just told us?
And is there a particular point, Mr. Oliver, on this, or do you want me to go from top to bottom?
Probably the best place to start is top to bottom, and I might ask you to go from left to right as we get towards the bottom. But
yes, so this is trying to describe the frame in which defence sits, particularly in terms of operations. So we've talked about the Prime Minister and the National Security Council. That then flows down to the Defence Secretary and Ministers. You have a Defence Board that we said is responsible for running the Ministry of Defence. And then when you come to the units that are on the bottom of the diagram, we acknowledge that there are things that are out with defence which are crucial. So that's why you're seeing the industry arrow and some of the what we call trading funds. So there's much more than purely the rigid department. Then we have a whole bunch of services that you require in order to fulfil your requirement to enable defence to exist. So is that our science and technology base? Is it some of the business services? Is it our infrastructure? All of those are part, if you like, of the fabric of defence, to then allow within that the Navy, Army and Air Force and Joint Forces Command to operate, and they are generating and developing forces that then can be employed principally by the Permanent Joint Headquarters and the Chief of Joint Operations when we're doing operations overseas. And within that is the Director of Special Forces. That was one of the elements that was part of the creation of Joint Forces Command and having a series of what were arguably disparate organisations previously being unified as part of a new command called Joint Forces Command, around which the Directorate of Special Forces was one of those entities.
Mr. Glasgow, in the previous diagram, figure C, there's a reference to JTF Commander, which is presumably Joint Task Force commander?
Yes, so that is the commander that the Chief of Joint Operations appoints and then issues his or her direction to. So that's then is going from the operational level
To the tactical?
to the tactical level. And this diagram is principally describing what we would call as the strategic to operational level.
Whilst we consider the direction and on to the tactical level, could I just ask you, please, to have a chance to look at some of the exhibits that you've provided? One in particular, AR5, a document produced by the Ministry of Defence entitled How Defence Works. And it may well be that this is a convenient moment, since we've come to the question of how we deploy, the routes by which advice is given, and the direction of advice and information. If we just scroll down one page, we can see the front piece available to us here, How Defence Works. This was a document that was drafted in 2010, so relevant to the first of the years with which the inquiry is concerned. Could we just look to the next slide, please? We'll see here listed as the aim, vision and priorities. The defence aim is to deliver security for the people of the UK and the overseas territories by defending them, including against terrorism, and to act as a force for good by strengthening international peace and stability.
Yes.
And as part of the defence priorities which were set out within this document, in effect part of the MOD business plan, the first of the sub-points identified in 2010 was to succeed in Afghanistan, and that was described there as the main effort for defence. Can you help us with this, please, Admiral Radakin? How was success in Afghanistan to be measured or defined when we're thinking back to 2010?
So the precise language of success would have been captured in the CDS directive in terms of what the government was trying to achieve by our involvement in Afghanistan, and then the CDS directive describing how those operations would be conducted and executed, and then that title, the clause there about the main effort for defence was to recognise the importance that Afghanistan had relative to other aspects that were going on in defence. This was the primary effort at that time.
So the primary effort for success in Afghanistan, if we look back to the defence aim, do we need to have in mind the last few words of the defence aim, strengthening international peace and stability?
Yes, in the sense that success in Afghanistan was a feature of that very broad defence aim at the top of the page.
Can we leave AR5 for a moment and come to consider AR6, which is the same document, although worded slightly differently. This was drafted in 2012. We can see how defence works, but this is the new operating model as it's described, and you can see that this particular version is dated December 2012 from the entry at the bottom of the page. If we just look on to the next slide, we'll see the purpose of defence. The mission of defence remains to protect our country and to provide the ultimate guarantee of its security and independence, as well as helping to project its values and interests abroad. If we look again to the next slide, please. If we look at the highlighted section under Transparency Framework, our current business plan priorities for which we will be held accountable by central government are, and the first of those, succeed in Afghanistan.
Yes.
So Throughout that period, 2010 up to the end of 2012, and presumably on since then, as far as the MOD business plan was concerned, the primary factor for that was success in Afghanistan.
It was the dominant military operation that was ongoing at the time, and hence it was elevated in its status in order to ensure that the department understood how significant success in Afghanistan was for the Ministry of Defence and the government.
Can we leave those documents for a moment, please? And can we come to consider the structure of the armed forces in Afghanistan? And I'd like to take you back in your statement, if I may, please, to paragraph 58. When we considered the various structures and the figures that set them out, you told us that UK forces were deployed under the command of the CJO, and that was based at PJHQ.
PJHQ in Northwood, yes.
And as far as the command that CJO exercised, can you help us with that, please? How was that command exercised in Afghanistan?
So the Permanent Joint Headquarters, colloquially, we highlight that it's responsible for deploying forces, sustaining those forces when they're in theatre, and then recovering them. And then in terms of Afghanistan, that was exercised in a command sense through a UK National Component Commander, which was a 3-star officer based in Kabul. That individual had 2 hats, the National Component Commander, but also was the Deputy Commander of the International Security and Assistance Force, ISAF. And then separately, the Chief of Joint Operations also had an Air Component Commander who was a 1-star officer that was based in Qatar to deal with the particular aspects of air operations.
And for the avoidance of any doubt, as we come to consider some of the structures that we're going to over the next half hour or so, can I make it clear that your evidence deals with conventional UK forces? So wherever we use the term UK forces, it's not taken to include special forces. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And thank you. Thank you. I'm grateful for you making that distinction because it's very important.
Well, I will use the shorthand of UK forces, as I'm sure you will, Admiral, but I hope that now everyone will understand the caveat that applies to the definition of that term. Can I just ask you this about the exercise of command, in particular Afghanistan? You told us that the National Component Commander was a 3-star UK military officer based in Kabul. And not only was the National Component Commander head of the UK forces in Afghanistan, but also the Deputy Commander of the International Security and Assistance Force, that's ISAF as it became known.
Yes.
So, in a sense, wearing 2 hats at the same time.
Yes.
On the one hand, a sovereign hat, and on the other hand, an international hat. Although the international hat is 1 step down from the top because ISAF was in fact commanded by a United States General 4-star.
Yes. And the dominant role and job of that individual was as the Deputy Commander, but that individual also had a very important second hat, which was, as you described, the National Component Commander. And I can explain what that involved if it's helpful.
Could you explain that to us? And what I'd like you to consider is this, where you have someone wearing 2 hats at the same time, 1 national and 1 international, how those 2 hats can be worn, if they can be worn at the same time, and whether there might be a risk of conflict when one's choosing which hat to put on.
Yes, so the role was dominated by being the Deputy Commander and how to conduct operations for the commander of ISAF and to allow success in Afghanistan. So that becomes when I say the dominant role, that takes up that individual's time in terms of a structure in Kabul and running such a large operation. But the National Component Commander hat is important, but it doesn't involve lots of time because its principal role is to just assure that UK forces, when you look at them in a very narrow, discrete sense, through a sovereign lens, that there is nothing there that's going to be demanded in the overall sense from ISAF that the UK might have a problem with. So that's why the National Component Commander is quite often referred to as a red card holder. So it's more of an ability to veto something that might not fit with the sovereign position of a nation, even though it's part of a broader approach that the commander of the international operation is wanting to achieve.
And so we understand the significance of the red card or the veto. If the three-star National Component Commander considers that there is not a comfortable fit between the international direction and the sovereign direction, is that veto automatic? So once the red card is played, nothing happens? Or do we need to understand in the sense that there is an ongoing discussion between the various commanders to try to see if a route round a red card can be found?
So in reality, it would be, as you describe, a discussion. And rather than this being something in tension and in conflict, actually when you're the deputy commander, you're very close to the commander, and you also have the added advantage that you know where your own nation sits and where there might be some aspects that are uncomfortable for that particular nation. So that in reality, in the formulation of those plans and in the formulation of the direction from the Commander ISAF in this situation, that's probably when the negotiations would be had, and maybe the operations adjusted, or it being clear that country X, or in this country, in this example, the UK, might not be earmarked to do something that would then require the red card to be played. So it's unusual for in these situations when you are so involved at a senior level and you hold the red card, it gives you the opportunity to shape operations and have the conversation so that the red card doesn't need to be played. And when it is played, it then excludes the UK, in this instance, from being a part of those operations.
So whilst I've termed it as two separate hats, and I've asked you about the possibility of conflict when it comes to wearing them at the same time, do we understand from what you've said that you regard this as a strength rather than a weakness, because it gives an opportunity for direction to be shaped at an earlier stage to avoid the possibility of conflict?
Yes, that's right. And in my own experience, that's tended to be the way that it's been managed. So there might be some aspects where the UK is uncomfortable with certain operations or certain involvement. The fact that that is known at such a senior level means it can have an influence on the shaping of those operations, rather than the National Component Commander being in a less aware position, and then they then receive the demands that are placed on that particular country, and then they have to play the red card. You actually tend to manage the issue away when you're so senior in the organisation.
Insofar as the playing of a red card might be concerned, that, as you've told us, is done principally through discussion that take place. But if a red card is used to veto a particular operation, is a record kept of that?
Yes, and the discussions prior to that wouldn't just be held in theatre. If a red card was going to be played, that would be coming all the way back to the UK, and it would go up through the system that we described earlier.
So would it be fair to say that the playing of a red card has some significance if it is actually played?
It does, but it varies in the sense of it may be a very tactically discrete issue, or it could be something that's far more significant at the operational level. So again, it depends on the nature of the issue for which the red card is being played.
And again, if only to make it clear, I'm asking you about matters in the abstract because, as you told us before, you didn't serve in Afghanistan, so the playing or the not playing of a red card is something that you've had nothing to do with.
In these circumstances, no.
Right. Insofar as the deployment of UK forces in Afghanistan, were they deployed to 3 different locations?
Yes, principally Kabul, Kandahar airfield, and various locations within the Helmand province.
And simply for completeness, just so we have all the detail, was there also a deployment of the Expeditionary Air Wing based in Qatar?
Yes, and as I described earlier, that came under a separate component that we call the Air Component Commander, who was based in Qatar.
Can we leave the Qatar deployment to one side then? Can I ask you about the 3 different locations where UK forces were deployed? First in Kabul, and where was that, please, Admiral?
So that was Camp Suta near Kabul airport.
And principally, what was the role of the force team deployed at that time in Camp Suta?
So the main role was force protection for both United Kingdom and ISAF force elements that were based in Kabul.
The second of the 3 locations you gave to us was Kandahar Airfield, and can you help us with that, please?
Yes, so this is where 904 Expeditionary Air Wing was based. That was commanded by a UK officer at OF5 level, so a group captain, and it was responsible for the delivery of air mobility, air attack, including close air support, and air intelligence surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, what we call ISTAR, across the whole of Afghanistan.
And just giving that to us again, air intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance, so known as ISTAR.
Yes.
And did that unit report to the UK Air Component Commander?
Yes, so the Air Component Commander that we referred to earlier as a 1-star officer based in Qatar.
Thank you. And the third of the 3 locations you gave us was Helmand. And can you help us with that, please, Admiral?
Yes, so UK forces in Helmand during this period were operationally under the command of ISAF Regional Command, Southwest. So that was a 2-star headquarters based at Camp Leatherneck, which was the US camp co-located with Camp Bastion in central Helmand and commanded by a US Marine Corps officer at the 2-star rank.
And within the Southwest Regional Command area, can you help us, please, with the structures that applied for the UK forces and the structures in particular they operated within?
Yes, so below that 2-star US Marine Corps general, we then had Task Force Helmand, which was commanded by a UK 1-star officer, and that was based in Lashnagar until August 2018, and thereafter at Camp Bastion.
I think it's August 2013.
Oh, sorry, yes, my apologies, 2013.
So, so almost entirely during the period with which we're concerned, Task Force Helmand was based at Lashkargah, and then it moved to Camp Bastion in Kabul.
Yes.
And other structures within which the UK forces operated in Helmand, did we have what was known as the Provincial Reconstruction Team?
Yes, so that was commanded by a UK civilian one-star known as the head of mission, and that PRT, Provincial Reconstruction Team, was co-located with Task Force Helmand.
There are a number of other substructures, such as the Joint Force Communication and Information Systems component, the Joint Force Support for Afghanistan, and the Joint Aviation Group. I'm not proposing to take you through those particular structures. They're set out in detail in your statement. Can we concentrate on Task Force Helmand together, please?
Yes.
And can I invite you to look in your statement to paragraph 71? As far as Task Force Helmand was concerned, you told us it was commanded by a UK one-star, so the brigade commander.
Yes.
And what was Task Force Helmand responsible for?
So that brigade and that brigade commander is then responsible for the delivery of all land tasks in its area of operations.
And in simple layman's terms, if it's possible to do so, what does that actually mean, so that we understand the role of the brigade commander and his brigade?
So the brigade commander has got the tactical command of all of the units within his brigade, and he's trying to fulfill the missions and tasks up through the system all the way to the commander of ISAF in Kabul, and he's focused on the land aspects, and that's dominated by trying to create the security conditions that was the main aim in Helmand, and then align that with the provincial reconstruction teams who were trying to further some of the civilian and broader policy aims with the government of Afghanistan and with their structures that they had in that particular province.
And as part of Task Force Helmand, did the brigade commander have at his disposal 5 principal manoeuvre units?
Yes, so each of these are the units that we would call a battle group. So principally an infantry battle group, or occasionally a dismounted armoured battle group, and they were used in a ground holding role within the area of operations. So their principal role was to try to create the security conditions to allow the success of the broader operation to be achieved.
And in terms of the success of the broader operation, you touched upon it a moment ago, do we have to think in terms of creating a stable and secure environment where the rule of law and the government, that's the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, could flourish?
Yes, create security and those conditions so that we help with the government of Afghanistan all the way down to district and provincial level, and then allow a handover to those national institutions and to enable them to be responsible for their own security and to achieve the security and stability that was part of the overall aim.
So if we think back to the business plan aims in the documents of how defence works, and we think of success in Afghanistan, in essence, is that what we're thinking of when we think of success in Afghanistan? Being in a position to allow the country to run itself and to offer a safe and stable environment for the occupants?
Yes. I haven't got the precise language in front of me, but a safe and secure Afghanistan that is administered by the government of Afghanistan, with a government of Afghanistan that is able to fulfill its responsibilities for the security of its own nation, and for international nations to be assured that Afghanistan no longer posed a threat to international nations because of that original issue with Afghanistan, where terrorists had been able to use Afghanistan in order to conduct events beyond the borders of Afghanistan. So it's a combination of all of those.
And if we need to look to the precise language in due course, of course we can. Can we just deal very briefly with some of the substructures of the brigade units that you just mentioned? And then what I'd like to try to deal with before we break is the provincial reconstruction team, and to get a better understanding of the role that that played. So just very briefly, can we touch on the subunits that were deployed as part of the rotations Operation Herrick? You told me a moment ago when I asked you about it that the brigade commander had under his command 5 principal manoeuvre units.
Yes.
And you'd explained that each of those in effect was an infantry battle group.
Yes.
But beneath them, were there a number of supporting units or sub-units that assist them in the work that they were doing? And of course, their work, you told us, was a ground-holding role within the particular area they were assigned to.
Yes, and to help those manoeuvre units, you had other units such as an explosive ordnance disposal and search team. We would also have a team of ammunition technical officers, and those would be deployed across the area of operations as required in order to confirm the presence and where they found them to subsequently dispose of IEDs. And then there were other, what we call enablers, that were part of the Task Force Helmand and supporting those manoeuvre units. So that includes electrical and mechanical engineers. So those are your armourers, your vehicle mechanics, the infrastructure support engineers. You then also have your logistics teams, and then you've got other specialisations within those logistics teams. So some of that is all of your, the fundamentals of who's cooking your food, who's doing the contract management, who's ensuring that the logistics are getting through. So those are all part of the tapestry that sits alongside and supports those infantry battle groups, and these, which are the 5 manoeuvre units that we talked about earlier.
And in addition to those 5 manoeuvre units, was Task Force Helmand also comprised of a brigade advisory group, a police mentoring and advisory group, a brigade reconnaissance force, an artillery battalion, an engineer battalion, and then a number of smaller component units?
Yes, so the brigade advisory group had a mentoring role with the Afghan National Army. The police mentoring and advisory group had a mentoring role with the police and the Afghan National Police. Then you've got the brigade reconnaissance force, which had the ability to operate throughout Task Force Helmand as directed by the commander. And then you had other elements such as artillery battalions and an engineer battalion, and then some smaller units. All of these units that we've described all fall under the 1-star brigade commander. So that's what he's got at his disposal in order to conduct the operations necessary in the area of operations that he's been allocated, and to conduct the missions and tasks that enable him to be successful and achieve what Commander ISAF has directed from Kabul.
We touched upon what you'd called the PRT, so the Provincial Reconstruction Team. We'd mentioned it earlier, but can I just have your help with that, please? In case it's easier to find it for you, it's your page 25, and it's paragraph 76 onwards. First, please, what was the Provincial Reconstruction Team, and what was its purpose in Afghanistan?
So this was a UK-led multinational team helping the Afghan government deliver effective government and security across Helmand province. So it's made up in 2010 of 260 staff, approximately half civilian, half military. The other nations are the US, Danish and Estonian governments. And then this is a blended team from the UK military and civilian side with people from DFID, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as well as those from the Ministry of Defence and consultants that were also used to assist the PRT.
And was the intention of the PRT to implement what was known as the Helmand Plan?
Yes, which was a governance and reconstruction plan agreed with the government of Afghanistan and international partners. And the military aspect of that PRT is fundamentally to provide the security bubble to then allow that governmental plan to flourish.
Now, of course, I'm asking you about the provincial reconstruction team in Helmand, but were there PRTs throughout Afghanistan by 2011?
Yes.
And was their purpose, as you've just explained to us, to extend the authority of the government of Afghanistan throughout the country and to support reconstruction and development within the country?
Yes. So the military providing a safe and secure environment in which civilian personnel, whether from the Afghan government or international government organisations, were then able to fulfil their ambitions with the reconstruction work, which was part of the Helmand Plan and was the purpose of the team.
And if the military role was to provide a safe and secure environment, does that mean that military personnel were focused on security and increasing security as well as stability within the area?
Yes, that's correct.
And as you mentioned a moment ago, as far as the military personnel within the PRT are concerned, under the ISAF command, and was there also coordination through the relevant regional command, and in particular here, Regional Command Southwest?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we've touched upon it, and if we can deal with it just before we break, the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, sometimes abbreviated to GRIOA, as we see it in the documents. The president was President Karzai, and as you told us, PRTs throughout Afghanistan from 2011 onwards. What mandate had President Karzai set for those PRTs and the role that they were to play and when they were to finish?
So President Karzai in February 2011 mandated that those PRTs were to be closed by the end of 2014. So in this period, this was part of a handover of security to the Afghan National Army and the Afghan Defence and Security Forces, and it meant that those PRTs had a set of principles and an approach that was leading to their dissolving as entities in terms of where they were in 2010.
So if we think in terms of the relevant period with which the inquiry is concerned, mid-2010 to mid-2013, at that stage, the target for the end of 2014 is still some way off.
It is, and the Helmand PRT ceased operations in December 2013 and ultimately closed down in March 2014.
So whilst we're concerned with the mid-2010 to mid-2013 period, we need to have in mind that the primary role of the military at that stage to provide a safe and secure environment in which the civilian personnel could undertake the reconstruction work.
Yes.
And the target with that mentoring and advisory role that's ongoing is ultimately to hand over to the relevant Afghanistan authorities so that they can take that work forwards from 2014 onwards?
Yes, so you have very important dual tasking, creating the conditions for success, that safe and secure environment, but at the same time helping to mentor and grow the capacity of Afghan institutions so that they can take responsibility correctly for their own security and their own nation's responsibilities.
And when we come to consider a bit more of your evidence either later today or tomorrow, will we see occasions where UK forces were working hand in hand with Afghan forces, be it the army or the police, in a mentoring and advisory role so that they could benefit from UK forces' experience and knowledge, but then take that forwards themselves once the PRTs had left?
Absolutely.
Now, so I know it's a few minutes early before 1 o'clock, but we're going to come to deal with a different chapter of Admiral Radakin's evidence. Would that be a convenient moment now?
Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. Thank you, Mr. Glasgow. It would be. Admiral, as I'll be telling all witnesses giving evidence, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone over the breaks. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll break now until 2 p.m, please. And can the doors and windows be left open so we can keep the place cool? Thank you.
Bye.